This is Theology Bits, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. I'm Pastor Ben. This video continues our series, The Stories of Creation in the Bible, and we've been trying to emphasize the different stories of creation. Most people know Genesis 1 and 2, but very few beyond that. This is our fifth installment where we'll be emphasizing Psalm 65, which is a very different story of creation. And Psalm 65 emphasizes something different. It emphasizes, as it starts, that God answers prayer. And we'll first go through what this psalm is kind of doing. It's not a long psalm. And then some of the big thoughts behind it. So first of all, what it says about creation. It's a creation psalm, but what it says about creation are a few things. First, it talks about creation as the deeds of God. What is it God has done? It talks about God as the hope of the earth, but more than anything, it talks of God as having the strength to establish the mountains, having the ability to silence the seas, and then says, and not only the seas, even people, which is sort of its interesting thing. It's the people are probably the more surprising than the seas. But this is the deeds of God, what God can do. Then it speaks a little bit, use a different color here, of the means of grace, what we would call the means of grace. It doesn't say that. But it says, what is it God does? Well, it is emphasized God visits the earth and waters it. Well, when God waters the earth, what does that do? It provides people with grain. And then it talks about how in that it doesn't just supply a little bit, but a lot. It overflows with richness. And so we see that God does this watering, and then the earth itself gets the growing. And so then the grain does come from God, but through a secondary thing, through the normal growth. And you see that emphasis. And then we get a little bit of creation. I can't put it down here, so we'll just do it up here and pretend it's there. As agent. The creation does something that, and it's specifically tied with joy. That the evening and the morning shout for joy. That the pastures and the hills shout for joy. And the shout there is not just any shout, but it's because the pastures have flocks on them. Getting back to this richness model, the abundance. And that the meadows are going to shout and sing for joy. And so we have a few points made about creation here. But it's interesting, it's really not about creation, it's about God. And two things that I would characterize as, once it wants to talk about what we would call the omnipotence of God. God is able. Means all-powerful. God's all-powerful, all-able. Look at what God's able to do. He has the strength. God has the strength to establish the mountains. God has the strength to silence the seas. God has the strength to visit the earth and provide all the people with richness. And even the creation itself exudes some of that strength into itself shouting out. Maybe you might even be able to say there's a little bit of the presence of God in creation, which is a little bit of what we as Lutherans talk about with the means of grace, that there is something of real value here. So first, God's able to do a lot of things. And then the second point is what we would call the benevolence of God. God is able to do basically anything. You see this structure of thinking of God as all powerful, but that what God chooses to do is all good. That is the benevolence of God, God does only good for the world. So you see, God is the hope. God is with this strength to establish mountains or silence the seas or even people. Instead of silencing the people, then he provides the people, God provides the people with grain. Instead of the creation as crushing down the community, it is the creation sings for joy, and the way it sings for joy is by providing this, what it is that people need. So the focus of this passage might be familiar to some of you who have had discussions of the omnipotence and benevolence of God, of God can act in the world, and God does act for your good. That is, God can act in any way God wants, but God chooses to act for your good. So it's not just a potential, it's an actual, and the actual is for good. So this is a different emphasis of creation. And remember, the point was about how God answers your prayers. Why is it that we think God answers our prayers? Because of these 2 points. And the proof of it is about the creation. So creation here is more of a witness, and you see that here where creation is out and out a witness, but more of a witness about the character of God rather than it is about it being something humans need to steward, for example. And so we have a very different perspective on what creation is and what it's for. Next time, we will look at one more psalm and the final in our series of the stories of creation in the Bible. This has been Theology Bits. I'm Pastor Ben.